emperor advanced with the rapidity of lightning. Victory said he depended on my speed. To me, France was in Grenoble. That place was 100 leagues distant, but I and my companions reached it in 5 days. And with what roads and what weather! I entered the city just as the Count d'Artois, warned by telegraph, was quitting the Tuileries. Napoleon himself was so perfectly convinced of the state of affairs of popular sentiment that he knew his success in no way depended on the force he might bring with him. A piquet of gendarmerie, he said, was all that was necessary. Everything turned out as he had calculated. Victory advanced at a charging step, and the national eagle flew from steeple to steeple, till at length it perched on the towers of Notre Dame. The emperor, however, admitted that at first he was not without some degree of alarm and uncertainty. As he advanced, it is true, the whole population enthusiastically declared themselves in his favor, but he saw no soldiers. They were all carefully removed from the places through which he passed. It was not until he arrived between Mur and Vizille, when 5 or 6 leagues from Grenoble, and on the 5th day after his embarkation, that he met the 1st Battalion. The commanding officer refused even to hold a parley. The emperor, without hesitation, advanced alone, and 100 of his grenadiers marched at some distance from him, with their arms reversed. The sight of Napoleon, his costume, and in particular his gray military coat, produced a magical effect on the soldiers, and they stood motionless. Napoleon went straight up to the veteran, whose arm was covered with chevrons, and very unceremoniously he seized him by the whisker, asked him whether he had the heart to fire upon his emperor. The soldier, with his eyes moistened with tears, immediately thrust the ramrod into his musket to show that it was not loaded, and exclaimed, "See, I could not have done any harm. Our muskets are all unloaded." Cries of "Vive l'Empereur" resounded on every side. Napoleon ordered the battalion to make a semicircular movement to the right, and all marched on to Paris. At a little distance from Grenoble, Colonel Lebedouyer, at the head of his regiment, came to join the emperor. The impulse was then confirmed, and the question was nearly decided. The peasantry of Dauphiny lined the roadsides. They were transported and mad with joy. The 1st Battalion, which has just been alluded to, still showed some signs of hesitation, but thousands crowded on its rear, and by their shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" endeavored to urge the troops to decision, while others who were in Napoleon's rear excited his little troop to advance by assuring them that they would meet with success. In a valley through which they passed, a very affecting spectacle presented itself. Many communes were assembled together, accompanied by their mayors and curates. Amidst the multitude was observed a handsome young man, a grenadier of the guard, who had been missing since the time of Napoleon's landing, and whose disappearance had given rise to suspicion. He now advanced to throw himself at the emperor's feet. The tears glistened in his eyes, and he supported in his arms an old man of 90 years of age, whom he presented to the emperor. This was his father, in quest of whom he had set off as soon as he had landed in France. The emperor, after his arrival to Tuileries, ordered a picture to be painted on this subject. It was night when Napoleon arrived before the walls of Grenoble. His promptitude defeated all the measures that were to have been taken to oppose him. There was no time to cut down the bridges, nor even to put the troops in motion. He found the gates of the city closed, and the colonel commanding the fortress refused to open them. A peculiar circumstance attending this was that the soldiers were not wanting to a certain degree in discipline and obedience to their commanding officers. Their only resistance was by inert force, of which they availed themselves as of a right. Thus the 1st Battalion performed all the movements that were ordered, retired, and refused to communicate. But the men did not load their guns, and they would not have fired. When Napoleon arrived before Grenoble, the whole garrison assembled on the ramparts shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" They shook hands with Napoleon's followers through the wickets, but they would not open the gates because the commander had forbidden them to do so. The emperor found it necessary to force the gates, and this was done under the mouths of 10 pieces of artillery loaded with grape shot. To complete this union of singular circumstances, the commander of the 1st Battalion and the colonel, who had so openly opposed the emperor when asked by him whether he could depend on him, replied that he could. that their troops had deserted them, but that they would never desert their troops, and that since the men had declared themselves for Napoleon, they also would be faithful to him. The emperor retained these officers in his service. In none of his battles did Napoleon ever imagine himself to be in so much danger as at his entrance into Grenoble. The soldiers seemed to turn upon him with furious gestures. For a moment it might have been supposed that they were about to tear him to pieces. But these were merely transports of love and joy. The emperor and his horse were both borne along by the multitude, and he had scarcely had time to breathe in the inn when he alighted. When an increased tumult was heard in the streets, the inhabitants of Grenoble came to offer him the gates of the city, since they could not present him with the keys. Being once established in Grenoble, said the emperor, and having attained a positive power, I could have maintained hostilities had it been necessary to do so. Napoleon at this time very much regretted not having got his proclamations printed at the island of Elba, but of course this could not have been done without risk of promulgating his secret designs. He dictated his proclamations on board the brig, where every man who could write was employed in copying them. It was found necessary to transcribe them over during the emperor's march to Paris, that they might be circulated on their roads. So eager was the demand for them. They were then very scarce, often incorrect, and even illegible. And yet the necessity of promulgating them was felt at every step, for wherever they were read, they produced an immediate and powerful sensation. The events of the last 20 years have contributed in a high degree to enlighten the mass of the people, for notwithstanding the joy they felt at the emperor's return, they eagerly inquired what was his object. All were satisfied with the national sentiments contained in the proclamations, and the utmost joy was evinced when it was understood that Napoleon had brought no foreign troops with him. His advances had been so rapid and his movements so unexpected that 1,000 reports had been circulated respecting the amount and nature of his forces. It was said that he was accompanied by Neapolitans, Austrians, and even Turks. From Grenoble to Paris, Napoleon may be said to have made a triumphal march. During the 4 days of his stay at Lyon, there was continually upwards of 20,000 individuals assembled before his windows, and their acclamations were incessantly maintained. It would never have been supposed that the emperor had for a moment been separated from his subjects. He signed decrees, issued orders, reviewed troops. All military corps, all public bodies, all classes of the citizens eagerly came forward to offer him their homage and devotedness. Even the National Horse Guards, a corps composed of men who had shown themselves most ardent in the royalist cause, solicited the honor of forming his escort. But these were the only individuals whom the emperor treated with coldness. Gentlemen, said he, I thank you for this offer of your services, but your conduct towards the Count d'Artois sufficiently proves how you would act by me were fortune to forsake me. I will not subject you to this new trial. On quitting Lyon, the Count d'Artois, it is said, found only one of the guards willing to follow him to Paris. The emperor, whose heart was so keenly alive to every generous sentiment, on hearing of the fidelity of this volunteer, ordered the decoration of the Legion of Honor to be presented to him. At Lyon, Napoleon issued orders through the medium of proclamations with all that precision, firmness, and confidence which usually attend established and uninterrupted power. His conduct indicated no trace of the terrible reverses he had so lately sustained, or the great risks he had yet to encounter. If it were possible to mention every circumstance that took place, I could relate a very pleasant private anecdote indicative of the calmness of mind evinced by Napoleon during the great crisis which was about to change the face of France and arouse all Europe. As soon as the emperor quitted Lyon, he wrote to inform Ney, who with his army was at Lons-le-Saunier, that he must immediately march with his forces to join him. Ney, amidst the general confusion, abandoned by his troops, confounded by the emperor's proclamation, the address of Dauphiny, and the defection of the garrison of Lyon, overpowered by the enthusiasm of the people of the surrounding provinces. Ney, the child of the revolution, yielded to the general impulse and issued his famous order of the day, but the recollection of the events of Fontainebleau induced him to write to the emperor, informing him that in his recent conduct he had been guided principally by a view to the interests of his country, and that being convinced of having forfeited all claim to Napoleon's confidence, he solicited permission to retire from his service. The emperor again wrote desiring that he would immediately come and join him, and that he would receive him as he had done the day after the Battle of Moscow. Nay, on presenting himself before the emperor, was much embarrassed and repeated that if he had lost his confidence, he asked for nothing but to be reduced to the rank of one of his grenadiers. Certainly, said the emperor, he had behaved very ill to me, but how could I forget his brilliant courage and the many acts of heroism that had distinguished his past life? I rushed forward to embrace him, calling him the bravest of the brave, and from that moment we were reconciled. The emperor posted nearly all the way from Lyon to Paris. He nowhere experienced opposition, and no fighting took place. Literally speaking, his presence produced merely a theatrical change of scene. His advance guard was composed of the troops who happened to be before him on the road, and to whom couriers were sent forward. Thus Napoleon entered Paris, escorted by the very troops who in the morning had been sent out to oppose him. A regiment posted at Montereau spontaneously crossed the bridge, repaired to Milan, and charged a party of the bodyguards who were stationed at the latter place. Thus circumstance, it is said, occasioned the sudden departure of the royal family. The emperor frequently told us that if he had chosen, he might have brought with him to Paris 2 millions of peasants. On his approach, the people everywhere rose in a mass, and he often repeated that there was no conspiracy except that of opinion. On the day after Napoleon's arrival at the Tuileries, someone having remarked to him that his life was a succession of prodigies, but that the last surpassed all the rest, I heard him say in reply that his only merit in this instance consisted in having formed a just opinion of the state of affairs in France, and in having been able to penetrate into the hearts of Frenchmen. At another time he said to us, when conversing on this subject, if I accept Lebedoyer, who flew to me with enthusiasm and affection, and another individual who freely rendered me important services, nearly all the other generals whom I met on my route evinced hesitation and uncertainty. They yielded only to the impulse of their troops, if indeed they did not manifest a hostile feeling towards me. It is now clear to everyone, said he, that Ney quitted Paris quite devoted to the king, and that if he turned against him a few days afterwards, it was because he thought he could not do otherwise. I was so far from relying at all on Messina that on my landing in France, I felt it necessary to get past him with all speed, and on my asking him some time after at Paris how he would have acted had I not left Provence so precipitately as I did, he was frank enough to reply that he should feel some embarrassment in answering me, but that the course I had pursued was, at all events, the safest and the best. Saint-Cyr found himself in danger by attempting to restrain the soldiers under his command. Soult confessed to me that he had conceived a sincere regard for the king, so much he was admiring his government, and he would not return to my service until after the Champ de Mai. Macdonald never made his appearance, and the Duke of Belluno followed the king to Ghent. Thus said he, if the Bourbons have reason to complain of the complete desertion of the soldiers and the people, they certainly have no right to reproach with infidelity the chiefs of the army. Who's those pupils, or even leaders of the revolution who, in spite of the 25 years experience, proved themselves in this instant mere children of politics? They could neither be looked upon as emigrants nor patriots. Napoleon seemed instinctively attached to his grand principle of acting only on masses and by masses, both at the commencement of the enterprise and after his landing in France. He was repeatedly urged to treat with some of the authorities, but he constantly returned to the same excellent answer. If I still hold a place in the hearts of the people, I need concern myself but little about individuals in authority, and if I could only rely on the latter, what service could they render me in opposing the great mass? The following fact will show how little communication Napoleon had maintained with the capital. On the morning of his entry to Paris after his return from the Isle of Elba, 150 half-pay officers quitted Saint-Denis, where they had been stationed by the princes, and marched to the capital, bringing with them 4 pieces of artillery. They were met on the road by some generals who placed themselves at their head, and the little troop thus proceeded to the palace of the Tuileries, where they assembled together the heads of the different departments of the ministry, who all agreed to act in this name of the emperor. Thus Paris was tranquilly governed that day by the torrent of opinion and the transport of private affections. None of the great partisans of the emperor, none of his former ministers, having received any communication from him, dared to sign an order or assume any responsibility. The public papers would not have appeared the next day but for the zeal of private individuals who spontaneously and without authority filled them with expressions of the feelings by which they were animated, and with the statements of passing events. In the same manner, Lavalette took possession of the posts. Paris was that day without police and without government, and yet never did greater tranquility prevail in the capital.